Hello, thank you for attending my presentation, and thank you to the organizing committee for inviting me. My name is Maria Chiras. I'm a PhD candidate at the Department of Integrated Studies and Education at McGill University, and I'll be sharing my dissertation research with you today. My talk is entitled Monolingual Discourses about Language and Writing and the Consequences for Multilingual Students in English-speaking colleges. My research is supported by the government of Quebec through funding for research in society and culture in Quebec, as well as the Department of Integrated Studies and Education at McGill University. To provide an overview of my talk, I will begin with the research context and then discuss my literature review and research questions, as well as my research design. Then I will discuss results and implications for my data analysis, and I will conclude with recommendations. So first, my research context. Montreal is the largest city in the French-speaking province of Quebec. It has a population of over 4 million, with approximately 150 languages. It's also the city with the highest percentage of trilingual citizens in North America. More than 40% know English and French along with another language. In 2020, first generation immigrants accounted for close to 40% of the city's population, and second generation immigrants accounted for over 20%. And now I'll discuss my literature review. First, I looked at Quebec and Canada language and social policies. I looked at Canada's Official Languages Act that sets up an English and French bilingual framework. I also looked at Canada's multicultural policy that supports a cultural mosaic model. And then I examined Quebec's Charter of the French language that mandates only French in all public communication, as well as several intercultural policies that encourage speaking French and supporting Francophone culture as the primary means of integrating to Quebec society. I then looked at Quebec language education policies. Quebec has a language-based education system with two parallel educational environments, English and French. The Charter's education clause prevents access to English language schools for most students and immigrants. In 2015, over 90% of students attended French school. Therefore, college provides the first point of access for English education, and English colleges and English courses are de facto multilingual spaces. I then looked at research on multilingualism. Language education for multilingual speakers is an increasingly important issue due to a rise in multilingualism in many countries, including in Canada. And the research shows that students do not separate their languages and cultures. Students use their linguistic repertoire as an essential resource in their learning process. And they also use languages as part of one continuum to access for different purposes. In English college classes, because students are assessed primarily on writing, I also looked at the history of writing studies. Prior to the 1970s, there were more formalist perspectives, a focus on grammar, mechanics, and a skills approach to writing. Then there was a shift in the 70s and 80s to cognitive and process approaches, seeing literacy as generative. And since the 1980s, there is a focus on language and writing as social practices, as being non-neutral, possessing values, ideologies, and specific standards in disciplines and in academic communities. So I'm examining policies at two levels: social and political discourses at federal and provincial levels, as well as institutional discourses in English colleges and English classes, and possible outcomes for students. And now we'll discuss my research questions. First, there is a lack of research investigating the extent to which policy documents may exclude multilingual perspectives, and this led me to my three research questions. My first research question is, how are multilingual students' linguistic practices represented in federal and provincial educational policies? My second question is, how are provincial and federal policies represented in local school policies? And my third question is what are English teachers' perceptions of the extent to which local school policies inform language pedagogy, writing, and assessment practices. And now for my research design. I used a critical discourse analysis for my first and second research questions, specifically Fairclough's three-level framework. And I used a critical narrative inquiry for my third research question, my teacher interviews. So for Fairclough's three levels of critical discourse analysis, the first level, the micro level, allows for a text analysis, a description of the text, what is being said, and the ideas that are being described. The second level, or the meso level, allows for a process analysis. It seeks meaning and focuses on how texts are produced or reproduced. And the third level, or macro level, looks at sociocultural practices, so the social function of discourses in texts. And so for my research questions, this is how it looks. For the first research question, the official policy analysis for federal and provincial ministerial policies on language and language education, I looked at the micro level. And then for the second research question, looking at local official policies, department policies on language, writing, and assessment, I looked at the meso and macro level. For my research question number 1 and 2, I looked at several official policy documents, and I'll break those down according to the research questions. So for the first research question, I looked at social policies such as the Charter of the French Language and the Canadian Official Language Policy. I looked at the Canadian Multicultural Policy and several Quebec intercultural policies. For ministerial policies, I looked at the first year English course, as well as a non-credit remedial course for students who are assessed not to have a standard level of English when they enter college, and the ministerial examination of college English language of instruction, which is a mandated exam that students need to write in order to obtain their college diploma. And this is where I applied Fairclough's first level of discourse analysis. For my second research question, I looked at department local policies for the first year English course, as well as for streams of the first year English course. And I applied second and third level of Fairclough's framework to look at the local English department policies. For the teacher interviews, I applied a critical narrative inquiry approach to assess teachers' perceptions about policies, their lived experiences, as well as to understand certain outcomes about language and writing and possible policy reforms and pedagogical development. For the data sources for the teacher interviews, I interviewed 12 English instructors from 3 different colleges. Montreal has 5 English colleges. I provided the teachers with a demographic questionnaire that they filled out before the interviews, and I also sent them the interview guide before we met for the interviews. So in the interview guide, I included excerpts from ministerial policies, including policies for college English courses. And I also included excerpts from English department policies for English courses from one English college. The teachers I interviewed had at one time in the past or were currently working at one English college. And so for consistency, I chose excerpts from that particular college for the local policies. Now for my findings. First, I'll discuss the findings for research question number 1 and 2, and then for my third research question. So finding number 1, monolingual discourses, and finding number 2, formalist standards for language and writing. Students are expected to master a standard version of language. There was a repetition of key words such as accurate, appropriate, clear, adequate, correct, coherent. So therefore, student success is measured by their perceived proficiency in the language of instruction. This is an excerpt from the ministerial mandated policy document for first-year English courses for English colleges, and excerpts from the elements of competency and performance criteria. And this is an excerpt from a local policy document at one English college, also excerpts from the elements of competency and performance criteria. Finding number 3, Anglocentric and privileged genres in language and writing. The main learning outcome in all English courses is the essay, so writing is the main site where success or failure is determined. This is an excerpt from the ministerial exit exam. Students are assessed on whether or not they've acquired a sufficient level of competence in reading and writing, if they're able to use correct English, and they need to write a formal essay of 750 words. And this is the exam that all students write in order to obtain their college diploma. And this is the rubric that is used to assess their comprehension and insight, their organization, and their expression. Finding number 4, deficit discourses for multilingual students. Deficit discourses exclude and marginalize students who do not fit perceived assumptions of so-called standard English. Categorizing multilingual students has consequences. For example, being placed in non-credit remedial courses or being placed in a remedial stream for the first year English college course. At the local level, English colleges sometimes choose to stream their first year English course. So they have the so-called standard level, and then they have 1 or 2 or even 3 streams of so-called remedial level for students who are categorized after writing a placement test to not have a sufficient level of English. And so this is the ministerial policy document for a remedial 60 to 90 hour non-credit course that students are placed in when they write their placement exam to attend English college. And if they do not have a standard level of English, they will take this non-credit course. Even if they're placed in a first-year English course, they may be placed in a, quote, remedial level of that first-year course. And the college policies for the English college that I looked at had 2 of these remedial streams for the first-year course. And in one of the streams, students who were placed in this level were described as having notable problems, who are struggling with reading comprehension, critical thinking, organization. And in another of the remedial streams, the students were described as having significant ESL problems or common language errors, second language errors. And in both of these remedial streams, students were described as having significant difficulties with motivation, general study skills, and time management. So a summary of the findings for my first and second research questions. There are monolingual norms and genre expectations in language policies, formalist approaches to language writing and assessment, Anglocentric genres in language learning and writing, for example, the essay, and deficit discourses emerging from the policies. And now I'm going to discuss my findings for the teacher interviews. So my first finding, teachers reported monolingual and formalist standards in the policies, the genres used to assess language, for example, the essay. They also discussed a lack of integration of genre knowledge or genre transfer, and a lack of integration of language crossover and multilingual approaches. So this is an interview excerpt, a teacher who said it's a very formalist structure. Our criteria is based on criteria that's at least 20 years old, and pedagogical theory has changed, just like literature has changed, but we still have the same lists since the 1990s. Another teacher who said they want us to get students to write a 750-word essay and look at literature in a formalist way. The problem is that the essay is the main form of assessment, and so it's very limiting. Finding number 2, the myth of monolingualism. There were misconceptions and stereotypes about students' literacies, conflating multilingual students with deficit discourses and undervaluing students' literacies. So, one teacher said that students are actually coming in with a huge range of linguistic ability. Another teacher said that the way the policies are constructed, it can cause teachers to not bring in challenging material, and we could be underserving students by dumbing things down. Finding number three, conflating proficiency with deficiency, labeling students at risk, special needs, remedial, notable problems, ESL problems, conflating proficiency with personal attributes and value assumptions, describing students as being not motivated and not prepared. So, an interview excerpt, the problem is that teachers who read this document equate ESL students with problem students. And another teacher, you cannot make these global assumptions because all the students have strengths. When you have this long ethnic name, for example, I think they're going to assume that you're going to be weaker and not as strong, or that you're going to struggle a bit more and that than a student with an English last name. And that bothers me. That bothers me. Finding number four, policy constraints and teachers unofficially integrating genre theories and genre transfer, integrating multilingual perspectives, trying to integrate students' prior language and writing, and overlooking formalist and monolingual language and writing. So one teacher who says, well, we start with the premise, how many of you did this in French school? And how many of you speak another language? And the teacher goes on to explain that if we view this as a problem, then we're not teaching them in the right way. Another teacher who says that when I teach the 5-paragraph essay, I tell them that this is only one way of writing the essay. There are many different types of essays, but this is the one you're expected to write. And the teacher compares the French essay with the English essay. And the teacher says, I bring up those things so students, can relate. So, a summary of the teacher interviews. Um, Teachers feel sometimes that their hands are tied because of the policies that they have to implement. Unofficially, some pedagogical practices the teachers are implementing are um, overlooking monolingual approaches and bypassing formalist standards, trying to integrate genre transfer and incorporating language crossover. All the teachers in the study reported that they wanted more data on students' prior educational experiences, on multilingual perspectives, on genre theories, and language crossover. And so the implications, the first implication has to do with privileged genres, that discourses about language and writing shape high-stakes genres with powerful gatekeeping functions. Genres such as the essay perpetuate a formalist approach to literacy, but also serve as an educational tool to assess literacy. And so the second implication has to do with compliance and integration, that language and writing practices and policies serve as a means of integrating students to Anglocentric monolingual ideologies, integrating students as members of an English community into Quebec society. Deficit discourses legitimize gatekeeping practices. And so the third implication entails deficit discourses and not valuing and acknowledging students' multilingual repertoires, which facilitates labeling students as remedial or special needs. It also allows for attributing negative personal attributes and characteristics, value assumptions on them being prepared or not prepared, motivated or not motivated. The fourth implication entails attrition and exclusion. So, genres privileged by academic institutions play a role in reproducing failure. A lack of proficiency in particular genres can justify excluding students and can lead to linguistic discrimination. And policies can categorize students, who succeeds, who fails, and to social implications, who belongs and who doesn't belong in an academic situation, but also in Quebec society. And so, a summary of the implications: monolingual and monocultural categorizations do not consider the reality of multilingual students. And therefore, multilingual students encounter language constraints in their linguistic repertoire because the policies propagate monolingual language practices. Whereas multilingual perspectives focus on the rhetorical context of language and writing and on the speaker's diverse linguistic and cultural repertoire. Multilingual approaches view variations in students' language and writing as a strategic choice that students negotiate in specific educational contexts. And so the main recommendations entail moving beyond monolingual language policies and teaching, moving beyond formalist language policies, revising policies to legitimize students' literacies, integrating genre theory, integrating multilingual perspectives, and more data on multilingual students in high schools and pedagogical and professional development. So, to conclude, we need to focus on recognizing and integrating cultural and linguistic pluralism, examining existing policies, for example, in intercultural policies, to find what I call multilingual spaces, to expand binary terms beyond a failure, success, good, bad, speaking and writing, to incorporate a difference, not a deficit model, to focus on the fluidity of language, to explore tools for students to assert their own cultural and linguistic identities, to embrace multilingualism in language education policy planning. I want to thank you for attending my talk today. I look forward to continuing the discussion in the future, online or in person. Once again, I want to thank the organizing committee for inviting me. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.